Advertisers, knowing your enemy, how your business is attacked. I'm not going to talk too technical. I think this is the wrong audience for that, so forgive me. If you do want to talk technical, grab me afterwards. I want to build on some of the themes that Don has raised around partnership and around sharing, and specifically build the theme around, I think, one of the key responses that some of the organizations represented here can make in the combating cyber attacks. One of the things I like to start off with is a reminder to people the difference between cybersecurity concerns and traditional information security, information assurance. Quite a lot of people say to me, oh, cyber, it's just a new term, you know, it's just hype, you're trying to create a market for yourself. But I think there are actually genuinely different things that have happened in the last few years. So I've sort of created this sort of timeline, if you will. And one of the themes that I want to bring out of this is it's a young timeline. We've transitioned from the very early sort of network computers in the early 80s to really quite a complex system of systems. You know, if you think that Google was only founded in 1998, the internet isn't even 25 years old. Smartphones, you know, the iPhone is, what, 7 years old, something like that. This is fresh stuff. And a lot of the responses that one wants to build into institutions or an organization just don't exist yet. And you look at the sort of the cascade of increasingly serious events that have happened over the last few years, building up in this side. I think the fundamental drivers, the difference between this side and this side, the era of connectedness to the era of mass interdependency, what was a technology issue now becomes a leadership issue. The drivers of change are the mass industrialization of cyber attack, cyber espionage, so people stealing intellectual property. The militarization of cyberspace, you know, with the creation of the US Cybercom only a few years ago, it really created a new military domain. That's driven a whole set of behaviors. The rise of hacktivism, people realizing that actually it's very easy to embarrass and disrupt a company of a target, do damage to that target, raise cause for their concern. Very difficult to understand motivations and to work against those guys. Organised cybercrime, and I'll come back to this as one of the sort of themes I want to build on. Bad guys realizing that it's really a lot easier to make a great deal of money using IT than it is to take a shotgun and stick a stocking over your head. I was talking to the head of security at a major high street bank the other day, and he's responsible for physical IT and people's security, and he's saying just the balance has shifted enormously. You know, whereas he used to be pulled out on a regular basis, somebody would be holding up a local, you know, the local bank. It's now all about, okay, we just found another of these USB devices plugged into an ATM and they've helped themselves to thousands of pounds and we didn't know about it for 2 weeks. It's really quite interesting stuff. The growing dependency on the internet. I think very few organizations these days don't depend, absolutely depend for their customers, their supply chain, communications with their staff, and it's happening insidiously. We haven't made a decision to say, we're going to put our business on this infrastructure. It's happened over a period of the last few years, and we suddenly find we're dependent on it, and you notice it when it goes down. And that's kind of an interesting thing. Don mentioned it, the Internet of Things, the rise of devices, the fact that we all probably in this room carry at least, you know, two smart devices with computing power in my palm that used to be a departmental facility 20 years ago. And then the last one, which I think is quite interesting, really has been driven by the Snowden event, is privacy and data protection. I think there's a real sort of sea change there as people realise quite how much information about themselves, their organisations is exposed and how it needs to be protected, and perhaps a reaction to that. So it's a real changing era, and I think that's an important thing to latch on to. I want to pick out of that the cybercrime element and look at some of the trends, some of the techniques, some of the motivations. But really, I want to concentrate on a central thesis, which I'll come to at the end. A couple of stats. I mean, there are lots of stats in this area. more or less well informed. The Norton Annual Cybercrime Report, which is published every year, they estimate the cost of cybercrime at $113 billion. CSIS and McAfee just published a report a couple of days ago which estimated it 5 times that, $454 billion. Staggering amount of money. And what's very clear, one of the things that Norton picked out, is cybercrime is now more lucrative than illegal drugs. So it's overtaking the drugs trade in terms of the amount of money that the bad guys are making out of it, which is a pretty scary prospect. You know, people know how to think about drug wars. And one thing that's very clear, I like this quote, PwC report that they did with the US Secret Service and Carnegie Mellon, published a couple of weeks ago. One thing's very clear, the cybersecurity programs of the US organizations do not rival the systems, tactical skills, technological prowess of adversaries. You know, the bad guys are getting really good at this, and they're not constrained by some of the things that we as commercial organizations, as governmental organizations, that they play without rules and they're making huge progress in their terms. When you look at the motivations, I mean, you know, in cybercrime, people want to make big money easily. So, you know, as an illustration of this, effort complexity. So this is the easy. The further you get up here, the easier it gets. The higher you get up there, the more your returns. So where you really want to be as a bad guy up here, you know, it's easy to make lots of money. And you look at the different kinds of cybercrime, and I've kind of excluded some of the more uncomfortable cybercrimes, you know, cyberbullying, things like that, which tend to sit down here. They don't reward in monetary terms, and they're generally reasonably hard to do. What is interesting, if you look at these, is it's all becoming easier for the bad guys to do that. You know, you can now buy online distributed denial of service attack. You put your credit card in, you name the domain name that you want to take down, pay your dollars, and that domain will receive a DDoS that will take a website offline for as long as you pay for it. It's pretty scary stuff. You know, there are open bounties for exploits. I believe that the highest exploit I saw was something like $250,000 was offered for an exploit per iOS iPhone, because it's a pretty locked down platform. People are prepared to pay for exploits. You know, there's a whole dark market around there which is driving behavior. So, easy money, and it's getting easier for the bad guys. It's not just about direct money though, and it's about IP theft, it's about corporate finance too. So I've stuck this in. And this is an American report, the IP Commission report that was published a couple of years ago, and they really went to town on pointing out how much the cost of IP theft, copying, counterfeiting was costing the US economy. And they estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars, millions of jobs. There's a real drag on US GDP growth. It's a pretty scary read, and it attributes some of the consequences of this to things like, you know, the poor legal protection around IPR. You know, you're dealing with parts of the world that don't have the same laws in place as you do in the US, for example, protectionist industrial policies and so on. It's quite an interesting read if you really want to sort of keep yourself awake at night. But it's an illustration of a theme that I'm going to come back to, which is how do you really quantify this stuff? A second one, which our own government published a couple of months ago, which I thought was very interesting, was published jointly with the ICAEW, looking at the vulnerability of corporate finance. And they were picking out issues like you go through a merger and acquisition, and in that time, the sensitivity of the information that gets shared is absolutely you know, paramount to the deal. You might be acquiring a £100 million company, but suddenly you've got a room full of lawyers and tax specialists and financiers and so on. And rather than being locked in a data room and sort of scribbling notes on bits of paper, they're all pinging each other email and reply all and all the rest of it. And they're finding that more and more of this kind of information is just getting out into the open, which is absolutely, you know, apart from being against all the financial codes that underpin transactions, is creating some real problems in terms of market transactions. And the bad guys are realising this. You know, if you find out that there's some merger going on, well, you know, let's monitor the traffic. We know what the deal looks like. Let's go and invest in these companies that will be impacted with easy money. So the Cabinet Office published this, and it was quite a good illustration of a particular kind of risk associated with cybercrime. And there are lots more like this. Key trends are rising. I think probably, you know, I thought I'll try and pick out a single trend. And I think that probably the single biggest trend is a rise in social profiling. So the amount of information I can find on every single one of you in this room by digging onto your online presence, the amount of information that's stored to you. And that's just, you know, open source. I can go, I'll look up your Facebook profile, look up your LinkedIn profile, do a bit of deduction, look up the land registry, find where you live. It's easy stuff to do. And that's before I go to commercial services that do this. So for a few dollars, I can then find a great deal more about you. And if I'm really bad, you know, I can use some other tools that really give me the sort of the inside line on you. And that allows me to target attacks. If I want to, I want to make an inroad into a bank, say, I'm going to target some specific individuals who I know have authority within that bank, who have access to systems that I'm interested in. And I can target you through your kids, through the schools, through your social activities. And this is what is enabling it, and this is a fundamental change over the last couple of years. And people just don't quite realise what a huge service they're presenting on the internet. You can't not do it. You know, you want to have a social life, you want to have friends. A lot of this stuff you have to keep going with. And a lot of this stuff is commercial. You know, who doesn't use eBay, who doesn't use Google and so on. It's very hard not to do, but it's extremely exploitable. And the methods, I won't go through this, but Don highlighted a couple. You know, there are lots of different ways of attack, and this is by far from being exhaustive. You know, there's the old-fashioned hack attacks. Well, not old-fashioned, they're still going. You know, sort of brute-forcing passwords and things like that. There's malware, which is increasingly common. Social, physical, you know, tampering with the keyboards, putting keyloggers on. There's lots of ways into your systems, and the bad guys are extremely good at doing this. So in terms of protecting yourself, well, actually the government's issued some fairly good guidance, and I don't want to sort of patronise you by suggesting that you know things other than what's been published. You know, there was the executive companion that Cabinet Office published getting on 2 years ago. They took the FTSE 250 CEOs and they gave them a good lecturing. The head of GCHQ told them what to do. And then they issued this guidance, and that's starting to trickle through into behaviours. More recently, the Cyber Essentials scheme was published last week, in fact. So that's providing guidance to smaller companies, typically. Don's pointed out SMEs, small and medium enterprises. So that's providing a good set of guidance for companies to work to. My own favourite is Paris 555 by BSI. I like it because it's actually quite holistic, although it's not as it's only a specification published by BSI. It's got lots of other things that people don't usually mention. So you know, you've got to understand, for example, your security context, your supplier and partner strategy. You know, picking things out of there. It's not just about technology, it's about the whole culture and attitude of an organisation, which I think is very valuable. However, again from this report, more than 2/3 of companies, according to this report that was published last week, don't know how much an attack costs them. And I think that's absolutely the pivotal point, and that's the centre of my thesis, call to action here. We need to find out how much this stuff costs. And it's not trivial. If you look at the kind of costs that you might incur from a cyber attack on the left, apologies, it's going to be difficult to see from the back, I'll read them through. You know, channel disruption. You know, my website goes down, suddenly my customers can't get online and make orders. Supply chains, I can't get hold of the people who usually bring in my goods and supplies. Internal communications, you know, you probably all experienced that point where IT, your email goes down. Do that for a few days and see what happens. Customer confidence, gets out in the public domain. People say you've been hacked. Well, I'm worried about my credit card details or something like that. I'm not going to use that organisation again. Share price, I'll come back to that. Regulatory fines, reputation damage, the cost of remedial action. If the stuff goes wrong, it costs you money to fix. Long-term fixes, though I may have fixed it this week, but actually I need to refresh my entire IT estate because it's tweaking, it's aging, and this incident has just made me realise that I need to get on with it. Costs associated with that. Loss of intellectual property, one of the hardest things to quantify, but one of the most common forms of loss at the moment. Loss of business advantage, so losing that, in the example of a merger and acquisition, actually finding your competition know about an acquisition you're about to make, outbid you or reposition themselves. Staff confidence, people working within your organisation who say, you know what, our company just dropped a huge clanger and I'm not terribly happy working here. My friends are taking the mickey out of me when I go home. Damages claims from customers and victims, even victim notification. You saw eBay having to tell people to reset their passwords. There have been instances where organisations have had to write letters to hundreds of thousands of people. That is no small cost. And those are just a few of the costs that can be incurred by these things. So quantify that, and you start to drive investment in security. You start to drive your whole security posture. When the CEO and his board know that it costs you X million every year, I know what my security posture is going to be. It sets priorities. The fact that it's quantifiable means that it's got board visibility. It starts appearing on corporate risk registers. It gives you comparators, and I think this is a really interesting point. A lot of organisations judge their IT spend, their security spend, either because that's what their budget has always been, so they've just nudged it up a few % every year, and that's what they've been allowed to do. Or they look at what their closest competitor spends, and maybe they've worked in other companies, so they all exchange notes. How much do you spend? Oh, it's about the same as us, must be all right. It's by no way a measure of how much you should be spending. Insurance, and I want to come back to this because I think it's a really important one, drives business continuity, drives training, your information strategy, so really understanding where your crown jewels lie within an organisation. A lot of organisations make the mistake that we just want to keep everything confidential. Those ones that are really mature understand that actually they operate in a global marketplace. They operate with a huge supply chain where information flows pretty freely, and you have to be really, really targeted about the information that is your business advantage, and it's usually a very small amount of information. And security governance, and it informs risk modelling, which is one of the things I want to come to. So an example of that, there was a piece of work done by a small law firm about a year ago, I think, that looked at the impact on share price of different kinds of attacks. And there isn't that much of this work out there. And it's not particularly exemplary, but it is illustrative. What you're looking at here is the 0% line. So what you're looking at are where your share price dropped below that and for what period. So interestingly, they found that actually hacktivists had the biggest short-term impact here. So that was to do with reputation, embarrassing the company, had an immediate knock-on effect on the share price. It also, the insider threat also had, so a problem caused by your employee had a very significant impact on share price. You imagine reading company X has just been, had some information exposed by disgruntled employees. That does a lot of damage to confidence in companies. Unfortunately, there's not much of this kind of analysis out there, and that's really my call to action, I think is relevant to this audience. Capture the organisation's costs, the impact cost, the preventative costs as well as the impact. So how much do you spend currently on security? Organisations roughly know that, they know it in budgetary terms, but actually if you say, okay, well does that include people's security, is IT security, and so forth. But post-event assessment, how much did it cost us when we got done over, when we had that, our website was lost, or I mean, very hard to quantify, and there's not much discipline around that yet. And many organisations don't know how to record it. And if you remember that list of costs incurred, You need that taxonomy of cost to really sort of drive that, to really understand how you can quantify this. Educate, raise awareness, enable, so within your own communities of companies, make sure they understand how to quantify this. Dare to share. I think this is a big ask. You know, one of the things that makes this, the sell of security really hard is nobody likes to disclose how much it costs them when something bad happened. You know, there are rare examples like Sony who admitted, you know, they estimated it cost, I think it was $180 million. You know, that was a rare example, a rare data point. If there was more of that, people would start to realize quite what the issue is. And I think the real interesting point around this is the potential to drive the insurance market. Now, there are insurance companies playing in this, and there are some early products out of this, but I think the thing that is really missing when I talk to some of the companies is the really in-depth actuarial data that allow them to write the risk properly. There isn't that pool of corporate claims that are flagged as cyber. I'm talking to some people in ORX and Oryx who are, as many of you will know, sort of collect corporate claim information. And although they monitor the events, you know, they claim, this is how much we were claimed for, and this is the event, so we had a data loss event, this is how much we paid out for. The maturity, the granularity of saying, and that event was caused by a cyber-related incident, is just missing. And my suspicion is that if you were to have that additional layer of granularity, you would actually find that cyber-enabled attacks and organizations, corporate and otherwise, adds up to a great deal of money. And it creates an interesting market for insurance. You know, to be able to offer insurance specifically to guard against forms of cyber attack, but to also be able to limit risk. So my other suspicion is that existing corporate insurance policies, unless they're very carefully written, have tacit exposure to cyber risks, where really they ought not, because the organization they're insuring hasn't been terribly mature in terms of their protection against cyber attack. So you're carrying unnecessary risk. There's an interesting market to be made there. And for me, as a security specialist, it's potentially very exciting, because if people are able to quantify the risk and the impact and drive it through an insurance dimension, as opposed to what exists at the moment, which are the sort of the well-meaning academic studies which start at the top end. You know, there's nothing more crunchy than an insurance claim that's been really tested by people. Do we really want to pay out that amount of money? You pay out that amount, that's real data. There's somebody willing to write a check for a cyber incident is real hard data, as opposed to me saying, well, I reckon, you know, there must be 1,000 organizations that have been done over like this, so it must be $1 billion impact. So I think that's got some real potential.